I have a backlog of reviews to get through, so let's continue on with the game that I remember fondly from a rental as a kid, Xardion on the Super Nintendo. This was an easy rental for me to choose from. The box art kicked ass, and I was a big fan of Transformers as a kid, and Mobile Suit Gundam and the Armored Core series later as a teenager. I recall beating this game and generally remembered it as being a pretty awesome game. While Zardian is not super rare or anything, it's uncommon enough to have been hovering around the $30 to $40 range for as long as I can remember, rarely going any higher. It was developed by a small, relatively unknown Japanese company called Xardion. The story of Zardian is hidden mostly in the manual. There's a lot going on, but the TLDR is that a scientist tried to terraform a planet to make it habitable for humans in some time. The planet's ecosystem grew a mind of its own and is now hostile to any foreign entities and started attacking other planetary solar systems. It's up to the other planets to set aside their past differences and send their best fighters to thwart the invaders of NGC 1611 and save civilization as they know it by finding the legendary mech Xardion. Later on in the game, you'll learn more and it all makes a lot more sense. The gameplay of Zardian is a somewhat weird mix of a Metroidvania and a Mega Man, but with the best of neither genre. From the beginning, you have control of 3 different mechs in which you can switch from at any time through the start menu, much like the original Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles on NES. Each mech has its own life meter, experience points, and abilities. Killing enemies grants experience points and levels up your mechs. Leveling up your mech only really increases its own life bar. Every mech has access to some of the same items such as bombs, missiles, and sub-tanks for refilling your health meter. On top of that, hidden throughout each level are other abilities specialized for the individual mechs. Each mech has 4 of these special abilities defined. Some of these abilities are more helpful than others, but outside of boss fights, they're mostly terrible. You can select all of the abilities and whatnot from the start menu, but fair warning, the entire menu system is pretty damn messy and kinda hard and cumbersome to figure out at first. I don't know why they made it so crappy. The actual gameplay is, well, pretty stiff. Movement all around is pretty slow. Each mech feels slightly different to play, but not by too much. Panthera is a shorter mech that looks like, well, a panther, and you can use it for fighting enemies closer to the ground, but he sucks at aerial combat. Alcedes is like a weird bug thing that seems kinda weak and useless unless you want to slap enemies with your nose thing. And Triton is just the best all-around mech, as it can shoot up, which makes it the most useful. Eventually, and spoilers, Panthera is replaced by Zardion itself, which is by far the best mech in the game. The enemies of Zardion are just about as basic as they come. Most have a set pattern and pose no real threat, but the enemies that have projectiles are significantly harder to avoid due to the overall stiff movement of your mech. Even though Zardion is pretty easy, eventually you're going to take damage, and that's where Zardion is a little frustrating. There are not many ways to refill your health. You can either die, use a sub-tank, or find life fill-ups that are placed throughout each level. The level design itself is all basic as well. There are enemies and platforms, you run from the left to the right and you shoot your way through everything, and there's not really much else to mention. There's one really weird thing though. If you visit a level you've already beaten, well, look at this, you're stuck forever. Remember Mega Man? If you get to that boss door of the level you've already beaten, it teleports you back to the stage select screen. In later Mega Man games, you could just exit the levels as well via the start menu. Does that work in Zardion? Well, no. If you didn't know any better, you'd think the game was broken or there's a bug that locks you into purgatory. Well, it turns out that you can get back to the stage select menu, and the only way you would have known that is to not only have the manual, but to also happen to read the very brief section that tells you this. You have to hold start and then press select to reach the stage menu. Could they not have made this more obvious? Each level will nickel and dime your health bar until you reach the level boss, and we need to talk about these boss fights. Rarely have I seen a game where the bosses take so many damn hits. It's hard enough to get the patterns down sometimes, but when the bosses also take like 1,000 hits, it just becomes a chore. It reminds me of the end boss of Who Framed Roger Rabbit on Nintendo. Seriously, you can dump all of your special abilities into the boss and it feels like you've gotten nowhere. Part of the problem might be that it's not always obvious that you're doing damage to the bosses when hitting them. It takes about an average of 2.5 minutes to kill some of these bosses, and your hands just get tired trying to kill them. The end boss, I shit you not, took me about 15 minutes to kill because I had to take thumb breaks in between forms. Just look at this, it's absolute fucking madness how much of a beating just one of its several forms can take. Like, I'm sure there's some secret to this, but for a casual playthrough, it ruins the game for me. For shits and giggles, I looked up a speedrun of Zardian, and no, there's not really a magic strategy at all to these boss fights, other than mashing and spamming your missiles and abilities. The game itself, I spent about 3 hours on, spending time to level up each mech and finding everything without a guide. I should probably take a minute to talk about the music and graphics of Xardion, which I believe saved the game from a terrible overall rating. Xardion has a pretty good soundtrack overall. While the sound effects leave a lot to be desired, there's some pretty decent tunes in here, so I picked out a couple samples which I enjoyed. The graphics are mostly pretty solid, and some of the levels have a ton of great background detail. The bosses all look pretty cool as well. As you get deeper into the planet of NGC 1611, you'll learn that it has its own biological ecosystem, and I think the art department at Xardion did a great job showing this aspect of the story to you as the levels get more and more grotesque as the game goes on. I really like the look of this weird face wall boss where the faces turn into skulls after they've been defeated. Too bad they all take like 20 years to kill. What the ass? So with all this being said, how do I rate Zardion? Trust me, I'd like to give it a good rating, but with all honesty, I just cannot overlook those wretched boss fights and overall bland combat. I have to give Zardion a passable but mediocre score of 2.5 out of 5 stars. If you want to play some good mech games, check out Metal Storm on NES, Metal Warriors on SNES, or the Armored Core series on the PS1 and PS2.